I know people are trickling in. That's fine. That's fine. I get it. God bless you all for getting up on a Saturday morning when you didn't have to come to this conference. I know that, hey Wes, I know that this is an answer to God's calling, and I thank you for being an obedient servant. We're going to open up with prayer, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Bruce Coates from Weinbrenner Theological Seminary. He's just going to give a welcoming statement, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord God, I thank you so, so much for calling us all here to gather together. And I thank you that for all who have answered the call. Lord God, let this day be your day. Let everyone who speaks, let their words be your words. Lord, move in our hearts, move in our minds, that through these messages today, we would know how you would have us to serve you. Lord God, I pray that today you breathe into our lives, that we would not be dry bones, but Lord God, that we would be soldiers in your army. So Father God, I pray that you would come now, that you would rest upon all of us, that you would fill us up this day. And then Lord God, let these be seeds that come to fruition through you. In the name of Christ Jesus we pray, amen. All right, and Dr. Bruce Coates.
Thank you, Dr. Imes. Dr. Imes is one of our faculty members in the clinical counseling program here. She's been the coordinator. She's done a fantastic job. Would you help me thanking Dr. Imes? And I know that our other clinical counseling faculty members are here. Dr. Arndt is back there at the food table, just happened to get up. Dr. Arndt informed me this morning that she picked up something at a conference she was at this week, a bug, and so she wasn't hugging anyone. And so she's not feeling well, so we're really thankful that she decided to come this morning anyway. Thank you, Dr. Arndt. She's the program director for the clinical counseling program, and Dr. McGibbon just walked in the back also. I point them out first to thank them for their wonderful job here, and also to let you know that if you have more questions about the clinical counseling program here at Weinbrenner, that there are three people who could help you a lot. Our students are our best recruiters because our students, their stories, their experiences, and what they do when they graduate are our best story. Clinical counseling program has been around for a couple of years now. It is fully credited by KCREP, ATS, HLC, and all those other acronyms that are just too early on a Saturday morning for acronyms. They are our students. Since we have been around, our students are 100% placed in the clinical counseling field. Our graduates, and 93% have passed the state licensure exam. We're very proud of their accomplishments, and our graduates who are here, thank you so much. If you are a graduate of the clinical counseling program or a student in that program, would you just wave at us so that everybody can know who to talk to if you have questions? So if you have questions about our program, that's wonderful. If you came here to fulfill some training hours, welcome. We're glad you're here. If you came here because you're trying to figure out what to do with that 10-year-old obnoxious boy in Sunday school, yeah, we can maybe help you keep your sanity, but we can't fix generation after generation of. So let me help you with that boy right there, okay? Love him because some days he grows up to be an academic dean at a seminary. If you came here saying, you know, I don't really know a lot about counseling or mental health issues and I need a little bit of help with that, that's wonderful. We hope that you get a lot more information. We hope that you leave the day not overwhelmed with terms like the biopsychosociospritual approach. We hope it's jargon-free that helps you a lot know how to approach things. If you come to events like this and you say, every time I leave, I really have my appetite whetted for a little bit more information about counseling and mental health, we'd like to talk to you about getting some more training. If you come here and say, as a pastor, I need a little bit more information to continue to do what I'm doing well, we'd like to talk to you about getting a little bit more information. We have a table set up over there, and I'm available afterward. I'm the academic dean here at Weinbrenner and happy to answer any of your questions. And that's all the commercial I'm going to give you. If you did come needing training hours, we have completion certificates for those who would need those. This one is mine, since I need this as a foster parent to say that I was here for 4 hours. And if you would like more information without talking to someone, introverts, we have lots of information over there Dr. Imes, thank you so much for all that you have done, and she is helping seat someone. She has done all sorts of things for this event, and we are so thankful. Dr. Imes.
Thanks. All right, thank you, Dr. Coates. I just want to thank everybody for being here again because, so first of all, I'm going to really apologize to you back there. I move around because I am a nervous speaker with a little bit of ADHD, so I fly around. Sorry about that. Yeah, okay. So I just want to thank everyone for being here. Some of you, you are here because I texted you and said you needed to come, or I came to you and said, hey, you need to be here. I just thank you because you know what? God is going to move through this event, and he has called you to be at the front, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So today's agenda is going to be, first of all, the opening, biopsychosocial-spiritual, okay? Biopsychosocial is actually the word. I added the word spiritual because I teach a class called psychopathology. And in psychopathology, it's all about the reasons that a person might experience mental illness. And so in teaching that, one of the things, remember, clinical counseling is a humanistic field. But at Weinbrenner, it's a humanistic spiritual field. And so as a part of the program, I felt like, hey, we got to add the spiritual side to mental and emotional disorders as well. So we'll be talking about that this morning. Then we're going to have Dr. Stephen Gersovich, the author of Mental Health in the Church. He will be up, followed by breakout session 1, and then the breakout session 1, if you want to know what those are, it is on your agenda for today. The first 2 breakout sessions, which are in classrooms directly out these doors on both sides, out this door, both sides. One of them will be for ministering to children. The other one is effectively ministering to those who are grieving. And then breakout session 2, one of them is on effectively ministering to people who are struggling with addiction, and the other one is honestly confronting the stigma of mental and emotional disorders and the shame that goes with it. Then we'll have Dr. Stephen Gersovich up again, and then we'll close with prayer. So I need you to understand where all of this began. This began, I'm a school counselor at Perry Elementary School. Anyone know Perry Elementary School in Lima? Yes. I'm actually their elementary school counselor. I'm an elementary school counselor, and I'm also a full-time professor. It's a long story. Just go with it. Okay. So, I was struggling to find mental health providers for my African American male students. I could not understand, where are they? I had a student specifically in mind, 10-year-old boy. I needed him to see a counselor, and his mother wanted him to see a counselor. I could not find one. I am like, where are our mental health providers for the African American community in Allen County? So I called Travis Monford. Some of you will know Lamont. That's Travis's little brother. Travis, come in. I need to ask you, who are the mental health service providers in Allen County? He looks at me and is like, what? And I was like, where do you go? He goes, you don't do anything. I said, what? So I didn't believe him, because I'm also skeptical. I didn't believe him. And so this is the 2017 Allen County Health Risk and Community Needs Assessment. I go to the evidence. What's the evidence? Well, there it is. Allen County African American adults dealt with stress in the following ways. Number 1, 58%. They deal with it, prayer and meditation. That rocked my world, because I am in a mental health clinical counseling program in a seminary, and I find out that's exactly what's needed. And then my thought is, well, how do I get this word out? How do I get this out of something that no one reads? How do I get this into the hands of the people that really matter? So going on, what about all adults? Is it just African American population? Is it all adults, across multicultural lines? Adults receive the social and emotional support they needed from the following: family, friends, God, prayer, church, Look where your mental health professional and prayer meditation, 42%, but look at where your professionals are. A professional, 4%. Hello. Hello, church. Your people are looking for you to help them. Look at your folders. Look at the front of your folder. It says Weinbrenner on the front. Will you please stand up if yours has a gold star on it? If yours, by your R, there is a gold star. Will you please stand up right where you are? Everyone stand up that has a gold star. 1 in 5 people in your church are struggling with mental illness. 1 in 5. And they're sitting in your pews. And guess what? They look like everybody else, so you don't know it. You can have a seat. Thank you. And God is saying, hey, church, he's knocking. Remember, he stands at the door and knocks. He's knocking and he's saying, church, guess what? I know everyone's talking. If you go on TV and you watch pastors, they're talking about Jesus is coming again, Jesus is coming again. I know Jesus is coming again. But now is not the time for the church to close its doors and huddle inside. Oh my goodness, Jesus is coming again. No, now is the time you burst open the doors and say, Jesus is coming again. Everybody come in, come in, come in. And so that's what I'm saying about with mental illnesses, which is keeping people out of the church. Open the doors up and say, come in, come in. So this is actually an excerpt from Time magazine. And it says, I'm just going to go down to the bottom. The black church is a different institution than the synagogue or mosque or even the white church, says Ken Resnikow, a professor of health and behavior education at the University of Michigan. Sorry, I said that on Ohio State Day, y'all. I apologize, my apologies. It is the center of the spiritual community and political life. Do you know what that means? It means this. We will address mental health issues in the community when it comes out of the pulpit. I'll say it again. We will address mental health issues in our community, in our counties, when it's coming out of the pulpit. And that's why we're here. So, God starts talking to me. All right? I look at this. I'm like, oh my goodness, it's in the church. It's in the church. So right away, it's in the spring that this is all happening. So I propose a presentation for the Ohio Counselors Conference, which was on Thursday, just this last Thursday, because I like to be really, really busy. So Thursday I'm in Columbus, and I'm presenting with Catherine Park, one of our students. And the presentation is called Plugging into the Power of Prayer, Using Prayer as an Intervention in Counseling. And so we present it. And it's at 8 o'clock in the morning. Guess what? People don't get up at 8 o'clock in the morning at a conference. Anyone who goes to a conference knows you skip your 8 o'clock session. You go for the keynote speaker. Skip the 8 o'clock session. Our 8 o'clock session we were supposed to have 50 people. We had about 60 people. You want to know why? Because people want this. It's the need that everyone feels, but you don't know how to say it. And so I put it in biopsychosocial-spiritual causes for mental illnesses. So then it's in the spring. I wake up and I had a vision. And the vision was of this train. Okay, so if you think of a train going up a hill, this train going up a hill. And I'm like, I got my eyes closed and I'm like, yes, Lord, I'm the little engine that could. Because I'm thinking, hey, I'm all by myself. I know this. I know this. I know this. I'm all alone and I know this. And God said, no, I'm the engine. You're just on for the ride. And so immediately I contact the faculty in the department. I contact the academic dean and I said, I want to put on a conference for the church. And I said, you just have to decide, do you want it to be a moped or do you want it to be a freight train? And they said, let's have it be a freight train. So I get a hold of Dr. Stephen Gersovich, who had written the book, Mental Health in the Church. He can make it November 9th. I'm like, bet that's an Ohio State day. But but it's okay because we play Maryland and Chase Young is out, so it's okay. So we're here. We're here because we're answering God's call. You are here on a Saturday morning because you are answering God's call. Can I tell you, congratulations, because you're on the engine and you're not at the caboose. Because I'm telling you what, God's moving. And you can either get on the front or you can get on the caboose, but I don't have any desire to be on the caboose. And so I'm glad that you are here, and I thank you for answering God's call. So the biopsychosocial spiritual approach, what does all that mean? Well, it means this. It started off with Worcester Insane Asylum, 1833. This insane asylum had so much success that 70% of the people who went in came out. The other 30% had to stay. They had a 20-year record of 70% success. Why? Because they had 70% success, no medication. Can you tell me, say it back to me, no medication. 70% success with no medication. Say it one more time, no medication. No medication. That's right. Do you know what the other 30 probably needed? Medication. Right. So first thing I want you to know is that medication is not of the devil. Medication is of God, okay? Because I know that if you have diabetes, you take your insulin. That's of God. If you have a headache, you take a leaf, and we know that's of God. We do. You want to know what else they did? They had music. They had square dancing. They had line dancing. 70% success rate without medication. The other 30% probably needed medication. And so, in the beginning, this is God's plan. In the beginning, He created people, and guess what? It was all perfect. God said, hey, and it wasn't just good, but we were very good. We were very good. We were healthy. We were well. But then something happened, and it was sin. Sin came in, and what happened to our bodies? With the sin came the death. Now, all of a sudden, your flesh is dying. Along with that is illness. It's disease. But it's not just the diseases that we see in people who can't walk and with arms that are deformed and they cannot see or they cannot hear. It is also in your neurotransmitter system where your brain doesn't work right. And so all of these things come into our bodies. And guess what happens? These things cause mental illness. So whenever you think, well, you know what, there's mental illness because of Satan. Yes. The answer is always yes. Because guess what came in? It came in sin, and in with sin came diseases. Not just diseases of the body, but also diseases of the mind. And so then there was also psychosocial factors. So what are those? So let's make it worse. So now we have these bodies that are dying. We have these bodies that are diseased and ill. And then we put in the middle of that psychosocial factors. What? What's that? Bullying. Bullying it's so predominant right now thanks to social media. There is so much bullying that goes on. I do not have Facebook, so don't look me up on Facebook. I don't have it. I don't have Facebook because, first of all, I don't have time for it. But secondly, Facebook has become a forum for good and a forum for bad. And I don't have time for that. Then also comes in economic factors. In comes the death of a loved one, which it can have permanent changes on your brain. Along with all of that comes strife in your family, comes addictions. All of these things happen, and you may not have necessarily the body that has neurotransmitter system that doesn't work. You weren't born that way. But these psychosocial factors can have permanent changes on your brain. But you all know this one. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So for us to ignore, it's Ephesians 6:12. Right after the whole armor of God. Or is it before? Pastors, tell me, before or after? Emily Hansen, before or after? Okay, thank you. She's a student. She knows the Bible so well. So the spiritual factors. Okay, so now, look at all the things that are happening to us. We have our bodies which are dying, our bodies which are sensitive to diseases and illness. And then we have these psychosocial things going on because we live in a society that has so much going on. And we have people who aren't turning towards God, they're turning towards worldly things. They're turning towards their addictions. They're using their addiction to treat their mental illness. And then you have the spiritual things. This is where Satan comes in and he says, you know what? You're hopeless. You know what? You don't matter. There's no purpose for you in this life. He comes in with these messages that are so evil and that are so discouraging. And so he takes these psychosocial things, he's taking these illnesses, and he gets into our minds and he says, it's hopeless. And when people are hopeless, they think about suicide. But we have God, and that's why you're here. We're not hopeless because we find our hope. It's an anchor for our faith. It is in God. And he pushes back out. He pushes. You can't see those. Those are arrows that are pushing back out. And in the future, those will be yellow. So, but he pushes back. He said, no, it doesn't matter. Heidi and I were riding together on the way up here, and we were talking about the term even if. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even if my husband has left me, I will survive. That sounds like a really good song. Yeah, I listened to that a couple times with my old boyfriends. I had it memorized. He pushes back when we have illnesses. He pushes back when Satan comes in to give us negative messages. He pushes back. And so now, this is your time to talk. I see people taking notes. What I want you to do is, it's an opportunity for you to talk. What have been your experiences? You're here because God called you to be here. You're here because either there's someone in the church that is struggling, there's someone in your family that is struggling, you yourself are struggling. So it's your time to talk about what you see in the biological causes for mental illness, the psychological and social causes of mental illness, and the spiritual things. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to talk about that. Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to bring us back. And I loved hearing the conversations starting. The conversations were starting, and I heard people telling stories, because you are probably here because of a personal story. A story that's in your life, a story that's in the life of a loved one or someone close to you. But you have a story. 1 in 5 have a story that's personal to them. And I put 1 in 5, but there was another statistic that was 1 in 4. 1 in 4 is probably more realistic because a lot is undiagnosed. Many people are undiagnosed. Now, for the person who left their phone at the registration table, we will not diagnose you. It's Catherine? It's not Catherine? It does. Okay. Catherine and I actually presented at the All Ohio Counselors Conference Thursday, and so she's here too. It was awesome. So Dick's going to pull up. I need you to understand that this conversation about the church and mental health, the conversation about the church and mental health is gaining so much attention. Neurotheology, you can write that down. Neurotheology is a study right now of neuroscience and religion and how it goes together. We presented that at the Ohio Counselors Conference as a part of prayer. Prayer changes your brain. Say it back to me. Prayer changes your brain. Prayer changes your brain. It actually affects your frontal lobe and your parietal lobe. And ladies, all my ladies who can't remember anything, please raise your hand. You know, yes, it is because you have children, okay? So yes. But it is all, did you realize that prayer and meditation for at least 12 minutes a day makes your frontal lobe thicker and you have a better memory? So ladies, let us pray. Okay, I'm just kidding. All right. All right, that's a true story. Neurotheology. Dick's going to play this. This is actually from the NPR. This came from Tuesday, November 5th. So I'm getting ready for this, and I'm preparing, and I get on NPR to look at a different story. Did you know that in England, they now have a prime minister for loneliness? Yes, I got on the NPR because I wanted to see that story. I was going to use it today, but when I got on there, I heard this. So go ahead, Dick, you can play that. And this is just a radio show, so it's a radio clip. There's nothing to look at, so don't look at me. Oh yeah, we do have to. Did you pull it up so we don't have to listen to the? Thanks. It's one of those annoying commercials that you can't skip on NPR. We don't hear anything, Dick.
Oh, you want to hear the ad?
No, we don't want to hear the ad. Are you listening to it? Okay, so a really quick story. Dick actually went to my church when I was growing up. So everybody's talking about Dick Dukes, and he must be like the most popular man on the University of Findlay campus. So I'm trying to get a hold of him. So I look him up on LinkedIn because isn't that what you do when you're stalking people? And so I wanted to find out who he was. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I went to church with you, and I was in Sunday school with your sister Dana. So yes, that was our immediate connection. It's a 29-second commercial. Sorry about that, everyone. And that's why we're not punishing ourselves through it. Is the commercial over? We don't hear anything.
This naturally raises the question of whether going to church more is leading to lower mental illness, or is it actually that the individual is coming from a more stable home environment?
Religious community, this is good for your mental health, but many critics have been skeptical. If religious people have better mental health, that doesn't tell you that religion is what's making you healthy. It could be, for example, caused by some third factor that's influencing both those things. Here's economist Jane Fruworth at the University of North Carolina.
We see that people who are more religious tend to be less depressed on average. But one thing that we observe is that individuals with a more stable home environment are more likely to go to church more. This naturally raises the question of whether going to church more is leading to lower mental illness, or is it actually that the individual is coming from a more stable home environment?
Okay, so there are some questions about causation and correlation here, definitely. How do you disentangle what's going on here?
So what Fruworth and her colleagues Shreya Iyer and Anwen Zhang did is they ran a study that took advantage of something called peer effects. All of us are influenced by the people around us, our peers. If you happen to have lots of religious classmates, you are more likely to become religious yourself. So in an analysis of 13 to 18-year-olds, the researchers examined not just whether kids who went to church had lower depression rates, but whether kids who had lots of classmates who were religious were also at lower risk for depression. So this technique removes some of the confounding issues, such as family background, from the equation. Just by chance, some kids are going to have more classmates who are religious, and some are going to have fewer classmates who are religious. Using this more conservative measure, the researchers still find that religiosity seems to protect against depression, and the effect seems especially strong for kids with severe depression.
When we look at the most depressed individuals, what we find is that increasing religiosity by 1 standard deviation, which is going from not going to church at all to attending church once a week, decreases the probability of being at risk for moderate to severe depression by as much as 20%.
It's really interesting. Although I imagine this will not be the last word on this subject, right? This is going to continue to be a debate.
Absolutely, Noel. And in some ways, I think one of the most interesting questions is, if religiosity does help your mental health, why is that? Is it being part of a religious community? Is it the rituals? Is it the belief? Can atheists get some of those things outside of religion?
NPR Shankar Vedantam, thanks so much.
Thank you, Noel.
Shankar is the host of Hidden Brain, and he joins us regularly to talk about social science research.
Okay.
You can listen to more of his work on his podcast.
So you heard it. Being a part of a church and even attending one day a week can cut down on depression by 20%. That came from November 5th. That was, what was that, Tuesday? Tuesday of this week. That came out. Church, right now, our communities are looking to us to help them with their mental illness. You can go ahead and advance it. That's okay. Sometimes this thing doesn't like me. I've been in here before. Okay. Did I do that or did you? I did? Okay, great. All right. So here is what I propose. A biopsychosocial spiritual team. Yes, remember Worcester Insane Asylum? 30% did need the medication. I think for us to say that people don't need medication for mental illnesses is silly. You don't look at someone with diabetes and tell them to pray more and they'll get more insulin. I'm not saying don't pray for deliverance, because I do believe in deliverance. But I also believe in medication. And so how about for the biological causes of mental illness, how about involving a doctor? Then there's the psychosocial, all the psychological things that life happens. Life happens. How about a counselor to help? But then there's also the spiritual things. The spiritual things. Satan lives in this world. If you don't believe it, look at addiction. Look at suicide. We need our church in this. We need our pastors. We need our ministry leaders. And then there were these two, Hannah and Taylor. I met them on Thursday. Hannah and Taylor were sitting at the Ohio Association of Counselor Education and Supervision. They're sitting at one table. I'm sitting at the Northwest Ohio Counseling Association table for Dr. Arndt. So we start talking. They're doctoral students at University of Toledo, which is where Dr. Arndt and I graduated from. And so I'm talking to them. One of them, I said, "What do you want to do in your PhD?" One said, "I want to be a professor." The other one said, "I think I want to do advocacy." I said, "You know what? I'm kind of doing both." And we had the mental health in the church flyers out on our table. And I said, "We're doing this." And I gave it to Taylor, who's in Lucas County. And I said, "It's not that I want you have to come, but I want you to look at doing this in Lucas County." And I told him all about all of this. I told him about the NPR report. I told him about this needs assessment. And I said, "Advocate." And I said, "Hey," I said, "what I'm advocating for is a new approach. Let's name it." And so we started throwing things out for names, and this is the one that we came up with. It's the Trinity approach. It's the Trinity approach. Remembering that, yes, people need a doctor. Not everyone, but yes, some people need to take medication. Some people, not everyone. You know who decides? The doctor. But do you have to just go with the doctor? No, you don't. But you go to the doctor. For the psychological stuff, go see a counselor. I know lots of really good counselors who came from a Christian, a clinical counseling program that involved spirituality in it. Raise your hand if you are right now practicing. Yep, right now practicing. Yep. And it's a good sign that Kendra's here because she's got the spiritual side. It's a good thing that Catherine's here because we know that she came through the MAC program. And then involving the church. Church. Here's your opportunity to be the church. Be the hands and feet of Christ. Guess what you have inside of you? Guess what's in each and every single one of you who's here and names Jesus Christ as their Savior? What is inside of you? The Holy Spirit, thank you. And what's the name of the Holy Spirit? The great counselor. He's a great counselor. He's a great healer. He is. You possess inside of you the great counselor. And does it mean that you're going to do clinical counseling? No, because in the state of Ohio, you do need to have a license, by the way. I'm also the ethics professor. But what it does mean is that you come to trainings like this and you hear how to effectively minister to those who are hurting. You come to this and you hear how to break open the doors of your church, kick them open. That's what I did to Dr. Gersovich today. He came in and I said, we're going to kick open the doors of the church and say to everyone, welcome in, welcome, welcome, welcome in. Because inside of the church, we have Jesus Christ, who is our hope. And just because the NPR doesn't know whether it's just being around a community of faith, which it is, or is it that Jesus Christ himself is there? We know the answer. We are a family. We offer a family to people. We offer hope to people. We offer Jesus Christ to people. And so with that, that's where I got a lot of my stuff from. Great book by Matthew Stanford, The Grace for the Afflicted. I'll leave that up there because I know I didn't give you guys the slides for this. Grace for the Afflicted. For those of you who are concerned about the readability of kind of technical things, this one is meant for just we normal people. I do consider myself just a normal person. Yeah, I'm just a normal person. And I don't mean normal. Oh goodness gracious. I meant normal as in we don't want just scholarly articles. Lay people, thank you. Okay, I'm sorry. Everybody's taking pictures and I'm in the way. All right. Next up is going to be Dr. Stephen Gersovich, and I'm going to read his bio. Dr. Stephen Gersovich, who is a medical doctor for Northeast Ohio Medical University, serves as the president and founder of Key Ministry. FYI, after this, go to Key Ministry's website. They have webinars one Wednesday of every month. I attend those webinars. They are fabulous, and you do get a lot of information. Key Ministry, Key Ministry, out of Cleveland area. He serves the primary vision caster and spokesperson for the ministry, and plays an important role in Key's efforts to develop collaborations both within and outside the disability ministry community. He oversees the implementation of Key's ministry plan and is responsible for the strategic direction of the ministry. He also serves as the program chair for Inclusion Fusion Live, an annual disability ministry conference hosted by Key, and contributes to Church for Every Child, ranked among the top 10 children ministry blogs and websites by Ministry to Children. Dr. Gersovich is a regular contributor to Moody Radio Cleveland and the ERLC, Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, and is frequently invited to speak at national and international ministry conferences on mental health and the other disability ministry related topics. His first book, Mental Health and the Church, was published by Zondervan in February 2018. In addition to his ministry work, Dr. Gersovich is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who combines nearly 30 years of knowledge gained through clinical practice and teaching with extensive research experience evaluating medications prescribed to children and teens for ADHD, anxiety, and depression. He serves on the faculty of Northeast Ohio Medical University and Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. He has been a presenter at over 35 national and international medical conferences, and is a past recipient of the Exemplary Psychiatrist Award from the National Alliance of Mental Illness. Dr. Gersovich and his wife Denise live in Chagrin Falls, Ohio. They have 2 daughters, Leah and her husband Max, and are students at Alabama College of Osteopathic Medicine, and Myra, who attends Belmont University, where she is majoring in psychology. They attend Bay Presbyterian Church, where he has previously served on the Session Board of Elders. Dr. Gersovich.
Well, I think the mobile microphone is probably working really well. First off, when I agreed to do this, I didn't know I would have to follow Mary because she's obviously a very tough act to follow. And secondly, I assumed that Ohio State would be the 3:30 game today, and I wouldn't have to run around scrambling for a sports bar in Findlay to be able to try and catch however much of the game I'm able to catch. So in any event, again, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm Steve Gersovich, and I'm assuming that this is probably the first time that you've ever had a child psychiatrist come to speak at your seminary. But I want to talk a little bit about how I came to be involved with this sort of ministry, because I came about it in a little different way than I think other mental health professionals typically do. So this is I think it was 22 years ago. I'm sitting on the elder board of our church. And we had a number of families from the church who had gone to Russia and Bulgaria after the fall of the Iron Curtain and adopted some kids with some very complicated emotional, behavioral, developmental disabilities. And so one of the things that happened was it turned out that these were devout, stalwart families in the church. And a number of them were struggling greatly to be able to stay involved because the challenges that they were presented by their kids were making it very hard for them to continue to attend church, to continue to be involved with a small group, to continue to serve in the various ways that they were serving within the church. So I'm sitting here listening to this, and at the time I was running, a pretty large child psychiatry group practice in suburban Cleveland. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I wonder how much of a problem this is for the kinds of families that are coming through a practice like ours, where their kids are coming in with anxiety, ADHD, depression. We're seeing a lot of kids on the high end of the autism spectrum, kids with other sorts of mood issues. And so in an informal way, nothing that we would ever submit to a journal, but after this meeting, over the next 3 months, we just started surveying families at their follow-up visits. One question: did the problems that led you to come to our practice interfere with your ability to be involved or stay involved in your place of worship? And I was floored by some of the stories that I heard and what we found out. And so, as God would orchestrate it, I had one of the 3 original research grants for Adderall, for those of you who are aware what that is. And for a period of maybe 5 or 6 years, I probably got to travel around the country, and I was doing maybe 150 to 200 lectures a year, grand rounds at various hospitals. And I would go to different places, and I would, as part of the introduction, talk about some of the work that our church was doing. And we started getting inundated with responses for help or requests for help. And so that's how our organization, Key Ministry, came about 17 years ago. And so basically our mission is that we work with churches to help to connect, connect churches and families who have kids with disabilities for the purpose of making disciples of Jesus Christ. And so one of the things that I've been aware of the entire time that we've done this is that our focus has been on hidden disabilities. Because at least in my world, and this is true of the adult population too, mental health disabilities are the most common disabilities worldwide. And about 75% of kids who have a significant disability where they're qualifying for special education services in school, et cetera, or other kinds of disability supports and benefits, it's a primary mental health problem. And so in talking about this today, I want to give you guys a very different perspective on this, and actually maybe challenge a little bit one of the statements that Mary had said opening up. So that part of the way that in which we've approached this as an organization is to recognize that there are things about the culture of the church that make it very hard sometimes for individuals or families who are affected by mental health issues to be able to be part of church. And we have looked at this more from an evangelism and outreach kind of perspective versus the counseling people and supporting people who are already in the church, although both are absolutely essential. So I want to show you some interesting stuff today that's going to get you thinking and talk a little bit about some of the research that's out there that shows that we need to be more intentional about welcoming individuals and families who have these kinds of struggles into the church. I want to spend the time, and for the first part of our conversation this morning, I want to spend some time talking about, well, why is this such a challenge for folks, and what are the things that make it hard for folks with mental health issues to be able to attend worship services, be involved with small groups, be involved with Christian education, other different types of serving ministries. We're going to introduce today and get you thinking about a model that our ministry had developed to help churches think about becoming more intentional with this in how to develop a mental health inclusion strategy at your church. And then we're going to wrap up by giving you some examples of some churches that are doing this sort of ministry really well right now, so that you've got some ideas that you can go ahead and take back to your church. And those of you who are involved in the counseling and the mental health professions can think about how you may be called to be a champion of this kind of ministry in your church, and to be able to come alongside folks who are on staff at the church to help them to be able to serve some of these needs in the community. So, really fascinating study came out a little bit over a year ago. And this was published by a guy named Andrew Whitehead, who is a sociologist from Clemson University, who, interestingly enough, has 2 sons on the autism spectrum. And one of the things that Andrew did is that every 2 to 3 years, the federal government does something called the National Survey of Children's Health. And they do about 100,000 very detailed phone interviews with families around the country, where they're asking all kinds of questions about health, disability. This is where you get like some of the statistics that come out every couple of years talking about, for example, like the prevalence of autism, or the prevalence of other mental health conditions in kids. So it turns out that one of the questions that they ask as part of this survey is, has your family been to a church or place of worship in the last 12 months? And so what Dr. Whitehead did is that he went through the database and did sort of a deep dive, and he was looking at the correlation between the presence of children with specific disabilities and involvement in church or a place of worship in this particular study. And here's what he found. And so if you take a look at this, the percentage figure on the bar there shows you how much less likely it is that a family impacted by that condition ever sets foot in a church. And so autism is at the top of the list, which I don't think is a big surprise to a lot of people. But take a look at the other things that are up there. Depression, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, anxiety disorder, ADHD, learning disabilities, that having a child with any or all of those conditions, makes it very significantly less likely that families will be involved with church. And this is a really large database. So you're talking about 100,000 interviews with families from across the country in 3 different cycles of the National Survey of Children's Health. And so part of the way that I started thinking about this is that there are certain traits that are oftentimes associated with mental health conditions that clash with certain aspects of church culture. And when I talk about church culture, what I'm talking about are the expectations that we have for how folks are going to act and interact when we gather together as a church for worship or for other kinds of activities. And so, one of the reasons why I think that this has been hard for the disability ministry movement and for some churches to be able to get their heads around this is that I think of this as being sort of the third wave in a larger disability ministry movement. The first wave is Johnny Erickson Tata, they have Wheels for the World, and it was understanding the impact of physical barriers getting in the way of folks being able to be part of church. So the second wave started maybe 10 to 12 years ago when there was this explosion of diagnosis of autism, and there was a recognition about the need for us to do more to serve individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Now, the third wave is this God thing that seems to be going on right now, where there are churches, there are Christians, there are folks around the country and increasingly around the world looking at this piece around mental health inclusion. And so part of why I think that this has been hard for certain pastors and church leaders to understand is it's what's different about mental illness compared to some of those other conditions is that it's very possible for the folks that we see to be disabled some but not all of the time, and in some but not all environments or situations. So that, for example, there's a girl that I knew who was very brave. She was valedictorian of her senior class in high school, who had severe problems with social anxiety, got straight A's, got accepted to some very elite universities, but had a severe panic attack en route to their youth group doing a summer mission trip in New Orleans, so that Dad had to fly out to Memphis and meet her because her panic attacks on the bus were uncontrollable, once she got, to be several hours away from home. So again, like most people would take a look at her and think that, well, where's the problem here? Functions very well educationally, academically, but in certain situations, the manifestations of some of the mental health challenges start to come out. And so I think that, it's hard for people to get that because we've historically done well at serving people who are disabled all of the time in pretty much every area, every life activity. And there's a lack of insight to how that this can affect some folks some of the time. When you think about something like depression, so that, it's an episodic illness. People can be functioning quite well. And I hear too many stories about, again, people get acutely depressed. They don't show up at Bible study for a couple of months. Nobody sees them at church. And it's very hurtful to people when no one recognizes that, no one calls, and no one, tries to reach out to them. So I want to think about this and get you thinking a little bit about some of the stuff that gets in the way of folks being able to be fully involved in the life of the church. So in the model that we go ahead and share and train on in different places, we talk about 7 barriers, and we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into these. The first is stigma. The second is anxiety, which if I had to pick one particular type of mental health condition, is probably the thing that's the biggest challenge for the largest number of people in terms of being part of church. The third is one's capacity for self-control, or in an environment like this, I can use the word executive functioning around counselors because folks understand that concept, because lots of different mental health conditions impact this capacity, and we'll talk a little bit about how this can go ahead and create certain challenges at church. The fourth is sensory processing, and folks think about this as being an issue associated with people with autism, but if you take a look at the genes that they've identified related to this, it's also linked to anxiety and ADHD. The fifth is social communication. And, churches are intensely social places. And so if somebody has a condition that impacts upon their ability to pick up on body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, inflection of voice, navigating all of the relationships at church is something that becomes very difficult. The sixth piece of this is social isolation. in that you think about like common mental health conditions. Oftentimes these are folks, they don't have as many friends. They're not as involved in as many social activities. When we think about this issue with kids, they are less likely to be involved in sports and other extracurricular activities, where they are likely to meet other families in the community who are going to invite them to activities at your church. And then the seventh barrier are past experiences of church. In that a lot of the folks that we come across may have tried to be part of church, but had an experience or had something happen that was so hurtful or so negative, it becomes very difficult at times to overcome that and to get them back involved. So looking a little further and looking a little more closely at some of these barriers that we talked about. The first is stigma. And I have a quote up there from Jay Adams, who was the founder of what's now called the Nouthetic Counseling Movement. And back in the 1960s, in reaction or in response to trends in the psychology field, Albert Ellis is somebody who was very influential at that time. Rational emotive therapy, where they talked about, basically everyone decides for himself what is right or wrong. The notion of relative values, situational ethics. There were certain folks within the Christian community who were rather alarmed at some of what folks were being exposed to when they were going out looking for mental health care. And so, Jay Adams was a seminary professor in Philadelphia who developed an interesting approach, or this nouthetic approach, to working with folks with mental health challenges. And basically, if you read his, the book Competent to Counsel from 1970, the way that he conceptualized this, which became very influential in certain parts of the church, is that there's no such thing as mental illness, that this is all a sin problem. And so that the assumption, again, is that, why would we need a special ministry to deal with something or think about it as a disability, when the core problem is that, that you don't have enough faith, or you're not trusting in God, or you have, that there's unconfessed sin or something else in your life that's contributing to some of these issues. Now, in fairness, one of the things that I would see in the context of my work is, are there times that people experience mental health issues as a consequence of sin? Absolutely. And a couple that I would see in the context of the work that I do is that I find it is not unusual for many of the kids that we see to develop symptoms of depression or become suicidal after they start violating sexual boundaries. And in particular, a lot of our kids who maybe have OCD or tend to be more obsessive or ruminative, it's not unusual for them, again, to become very depressed, because basically the kinds of kids I work with don't have the maturity to be able to deal with the intensity of the emotions that result from those situations. Or I think about, another example of this would be some of the teenagers that we see who end up playing around on the internet and getting involved with pornography and some of the issues that leads to. So that's certainly clear. But it's also true, and one of the things that I found doing this kind of ministry and getting a chance to, meet lots of faithful Christians, including some people in very prominent leadership positions, is that there are some extraordinarily faithful people, who are devoted to God, and they're living out the gospel on a day-to-day basis, and they're still struggling with this stuff. I met Kay Warren, that their family had been through a lot because of Matthew's suicide. Chuck Swindoll's family has been through a lot of this, and there's a multi-generational history of issues with depression and anxiety and autism in his family. And so that there are, some very godly people where it's eminently clear that God may be using these, God may be using some of the stuff that they're struggling with, for other purposes, and that it's clearly not an issue with sin. The other issue that comes up here is that there has over time developed a very widespread perception in the unchurched community that people who struggle with mental health issues won't be welcomed at church. And so this is data from a study that was done about 5 years ago by Focus on the Family and Lifeway Research. And they were doing a study looking at families who had an adult with severe mental illness, either schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. They interviewed family members. They interviewed 1,000 pastors. They also interviewed several hundred adults as part of this study who had family members with mental illness who were not actively involved in attending church. And so, when they asked them the question whether or not they thought they would be welcome at church, 55% of them basically said no. And so that, if you take a look at like Mary's data that she talked about, the 1 in 4 data in terms of folks affected by mental illness is probably from the adult population. 1 in 5 is what we see in kids. That 20 to 25% of the folks in your community are struggling with this, and there's a good possibility that the majority of them don't think that they're going to be welcome if they come to your church. And so thinking about, and one of the things we're going to talk about in the second half of the discussion at the end of the day, are what are some of the things that you can do as a church to be able to change some of those perceptions within your community. Okay, so the second barrier that we look at is anxiety. And if I were going to give you sort of like the 30-second in a nutshell psychiatrist description of like what we see from neuroimaging studies and folks who have been studied with this, is that basically people with anxiety have been hardwired to overestimate the level of risk entering into new or unfamiliar situations. Oftentimes folks who struggle with this have sort of excessive fears about being scrutinized or judged by other people. We see, a couple of issues that we see as being, for the kinds of kids that we work with, is that in larger churches where kids are expected to go to a different part of the church and encouraged to not be present in the adult worship services, the time in which parents are going in one direction and kids are going in another for kids who struggle with separation is oftentimes a really big issue. And so I'm going to give you a little thing to think about in a few minutes, to kind of consider like how big a challenge this might be to somebody trying to attend church for the first time. If in fact they're among like the 8 to 12% of teenagers who struggle with severe anxiety, 80% of whom never get any kind of treatment, medicine, counseling, anything, and the 7.5% of the adult population that meets criteria for social anxiety disorder. So what are some of the things that become like really hard for kids at church? I touched on a minute ago. So the first one is, for some kids, it's a process of separating from their parents. There is a very large, prominent church in the community where I practice, where the pastor feels very strongly that kids and teens need to be in their age-appropriate worship. So a family from my practice decides to go there and check it out on a Sunday night. And the parents inform their daughter of the fact that she would be going to a different part of the church when they got inside. She had a complete meltdown, and after 15 minutes of rolling around on the asphalt in the church parking lot, the family ended up having to go home. A second issue, and something that we see a lot, is that there are folks who may be able to come to worship like every Sunday because it's very familiar and very comfortable to them. But you do anything that's different or outside the normal routine, and they get thrown for a loop. And so example of this is that there was a kid that I saw, and they were in the 3rd grade and had issues with separation anxiety, ADHD, learning disabilities, didn't tolerate medicine really well, and so that there's a school in suburban Cleveland specifically that's set up to work with kids with ADHD and or learning disabilities. So we had to wrestle through some issues with his separation anxiety to get him to go there, because where their house was, he could look out his bedroom window and see the school, and he could look out his window at school and see the house and know that his mom was there. When he was going to school 20 miles away from there, he had some struggles, but we got through it. So this kid would go to church every Sunday, would sit with his parents in the adult worship service. So now he's in 6th grade. And the middle school ministry event of the year is that they do a 2-day fall retreat on Kelly's Island in the middle of Lake Erie. When the mom told him, and the family was put under a lot of social pressure by the middle school pastor to send him to this event. And when he was told that he would be going to this, the kid had a severe meltdown, became very physically aggressive to mom, and it's fortunate that mom's brother just happened to drop by at the time. Otherwise, she might have gotten pretty severely hurt. And so that this kid, he'd be able to go to church every week, but when you tell him that you're going to be going away from Friday to Sunday with 100 kids, most of whom he's not familiar with, and you're going to be on an island in the middle of Lake Erie that is only served by a ferry that only runs during the daytime, you can see where we would have some challenges. Now, a third issue to think about is that for a lot of our churches, the center of their discipleship strategy is built around small groups. Can you imagine folks who wrestle with anxiety maybe having difficulty being able to self-disclose in these kinds of groups? Or kids feeling comfortable. Another place where they fall away are the transitions from elementary school to middle school ministry and middle school to high school ministry. So that, you've got maybe, you've got your Sunday school teacher, you've got your small group leader, and you go from middle school to high school, and you're in a 9th grader walking into a big room where there are 50 to 100 older kids, all of whom who already have their friends and are gathered together in small groups, and most of whom you don't recognize because this being church, kids come from a lot of different schools. And so, that there are all kinds of different places where, things can get hung up, and folks, even folks who've been involved with church can struggle to, enter into a different environment or enter into a different activity. Okay, here's some of the challenges for adults who struggle with anxiety. So that, imagine what it's like, going to a church for the first time, if you're someone who's anxious. One of the things that we know is that a lot of these folks now will spend time on church websites before they go, watching the sermon, looking for as many pictures as they can. Because people with anxiety, they go into a new situation. They do not want to be the focus of attention. So, if you're going to visit a new church, how is everybody going to be dressed? How are the kids going to be dressed? Is there going to be anything that will happen that will, cause me to feel, to stand out or to be signaled out? I've heard of these horror stories of places where they have the newcomers stand and they walk around passing out a microphone and asking them to go ahead and introduce themselves, which, for someone with social anxiety or performance anxiety is, very challenging. I know that when my son-in-law started medical school and he was going around looking for a church, the first place he went into was rather interesting. And they made a point of having everybody get up and lay their hands on and pray for the newcomer. He did not go back to that church, and he and my daughter are going to somewhere else in that community. Here's an interesting one that we're working with a very, very large church in Texas around developing a mental health strategy. And one of the things that they did last month is that they had a mental health focused Sunday. And so that they have several hundred Stevens ministers in this church. And they had one of them get up and talk about the fact that she couldn't go to church with her husband for the longest time because he has agoraphobia. And again, very large church, it's not unusual for 10,000 people to be there at a worship service at a time. And, the concern was he wouldn't go to church because he was worried that, you'd have a panic attack and wouldn't be able to get out. So that they had worked with the usher team at that church to ensure that he had a reserved seat at the end of an aisle next to an exit where he felt more comfortable. And in fact, her husband now serves as a member of the usher team at that church, since he was able to go. One of the things, I'm of the age that like in the 1980s when I was like in college and med school and looking for a church, everybody had coffee hours. And so that, when you have sort of these welcoming kinds of things where everybody's pouncing on the newcomer, again, that's something that's very, very challenging. Stuff like, and we were involved with a study for the federal government where we were looking at sort of safety and side effect issues associated with the antidepressant, anti-anxiety medicines in kids. One of the things that we learned that was really interesting is the extent to which folks with anxiety struggle to talk on the phone. We had kids in this study who would have 13,000 texts and 0 minutes of talk time every month. And so if in order to be part of a group or to go ahead and volunteer, if you see in the church bulletin that you have to pick up the phone and call someone, for a lot of folks, that's much more difficult than using electronic communication, to be able to text or email. So one of the strategies that we oftentimes talk about is having an assigned mental health liaison within the church, that if somebody's having some struggles, they have one person that they can email, and that person can then turn around and sort of run interference for them with different ministry leaders or with any activities or experiences where they might struggle. Okay, so self-control. And we talk about the term executive functioning, and when I throw this around, we're talking about different processes in the brain that basically regulate and oversee everything else that goes on in the brain. And so that there are 5 of these that are key. One is behavioral inhibition, which is the most basic. Like when you're a kid, you have to be able to not step out in front of a car when you're walking out of Walmart or put your hand on a hot stove. But you think about like things like verbal and nonverbal working memory, and this has to do with the ability to take things that you have learned in one situation and to be able to apply it in another, to be able to learn from your mistakes, so that people who struggle with some of this stuff would have a very hard time being able to take what they read in the Bible or hear what they, to take what they heard in a sermon and to be able to turn around and apply it in real life. Folks who struggle with emotional self-regulation, which is the ability to hide your emotions from other people when it is socially appropriate to do so, will oftentimes, experience significant challenges with church. The 5th is sort of a catch-all category that we call reconstitution. And a way of thinking about this is it's kind of like the DVR in your brain that allows you to be able to replay different situations and to problem solve how you might approach them differently. And so that we know that folks who struggle with this often have a hard time managing time. They underestimate the amount of time it will take to go somewhere. My wife, who used to work as the greeter in our children's ministry area, could figure out who these folks were because at 12 minutes after the start of the service, the moms are hopping across the parking lot with one heel on, trying to get their other shoe on while they have a child draped around their neck. We know that folks, like for example, if you think about ADHD as sort of the model for this, but other mental health conditions impact it, have a hard time being able to delay gratification, to set priorities, to be able to avoid things that we want them to avoid. So like we know, for example, folks with ADHD are 2.5 times more likely to develop a substance use disorder than folks in the general population. And so part of what happens with this is that, and the best way that I've seen this described is our church, this was 20 years ago, we did our first Disability Ministry Sunday. And we had different families get up and give their testimonies about how the stuff that our church was doing, the impact it was having on their family and their ability to be able to, to come to know Christ, to be able to grow in their faith, to be able to practice and serve. And so one of the families I happened to be familiar with on a professional basis, they had 2 sons who were 5 and 7 who had severe ADHD. And so they were talking about what their experience was like as a family looking for a church in suburban Cleveland, with a couple of kids with these challenges in the early 1990s. And the comment that the mom made was that people in the church think they could tell when a disability ends and bad parenting begins. And so, it's these hidden disabilities. It's the kids with all kinds of, adverse childhood experiences who are involved in foster care or involved in adoption, where this is oftentimes becomes, a significant challenge. Many of us in the church tend to become very judgmental of other folks, particularly when it's kids. And there's the assumption, well, they don't care enough to parent them in the way in which that they should, or they're not disciplining their kids, or they're too into their own stuff. And folks pick up on this, and oftentimes that is, you think back to Dr. Whitehead's study, one of the reasons why it may be that so many of these folks aren't regularly going to church. Sensory processing is sort of the fourth barrier. And that, there are lots of times where, for someone who struggles with this, the noise, the light, the sound, being in close proximity to lots of different people who are wearing lots of perfume and cologne will become a significant challenge for folks. And where this is particularly difficult for people would be coming into or leaving church when it's busy and there's 15 or 20 different conversations going on within a 10 to 15 foot radius of where you are. One of the things that we see a lot of times with kids is that some of these very high energy worship kinds of experiences, with lots of music and lots of stimulation, they may be fine for some kids, but if you're a kid who struggles with self-control, and one of the issues is that the more stuff you have to process, the less cognitive capacity you have for self-control. This can become a real problem. And so we know that a lot of times sort of pick-up time, drop-off time, when kids are moving from their large group worship to their small group areas where they would be involved with a leader, these kind of transition times that we know that some kids are more vulnerable to aggressive behavior. You think about some of the issues with adults, and there are a lot of churches where they're into very sort of touchy, huggy kinds of things. That doesn't work real well for a lot of people. And this is something, and it's included, we included this in the book, but about 5 or 6 years ago, we got a really interesting email from a college-age student in Europe who had been diagnosed with Asperger's, who talked about some of her experiences and struggles in trying to do church. And in particular, the sensory component of it, in terms of the music, the smells, the touching, was a significant issue. Again, social communication being the fifth, and we sort of touched on this before. And again, you think about, how hard is it to be part of a small group when this is something that you wrestle with? One of the things that we see a lot of times is that there are folks who struggle with pragmatic language, or they'll know what to say or what to do in sort of day-to-day kinds of situations, but coming to church isn't necessarily a day-to-day situation for a lot of people. And sort of picking up on the lingo and the way that you're supposed to talk, and being able to navigate sort of the chit-chat, small talk kinds of things with folks will oftentimes be a struggle for them. Social isolation, so that we said before that folks who have kids with mental illness are less likely to have their kids involved in the kinds of extracurricular activities where they meet other families. It's also extremely hard for folks to find childcare and babysitters when they have kids who wrestle with these issues, so that the parents aren't getting a chance to go out to dinner with other folks who will invite them somewhere to church. It's interesting that I know a very prominent national ministry leader where she and her husband adopted 4 kids, and she told me they have not been out to dinner together in over 15 years because of some of the challenges that they have with their kids, having no one capable of watching them, and not, interestingly enough, having any churches in their areas willing to step up and do this type of child care or offering any sort of respite. And again, you think about some of the most common mental health conditions. When people get depressed, they isolate themselves from other folks, and that's a core symptom. When people get anxious, they're going to tend to avoid other people, and as we talked about, be uncomfortable with initiating new friendships and entering into new social situations. So part of the challenge here is figuring out, well, if this subset of people doesn't know anybody in your church to be able to invite them to church, how do we think about developing a process of go and tell in terms of taking the church out to them? You know, we experimented and piloted with some interesting things with social media and online church as a way possibly of being able to, to reach some of these folks. That's something we can talk about a little bit later if you'd like. One of the things I learned really fast in child psychiatry school is that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, and that kids with issues oftentimes had parents with issues. And so it's not unusual to see this really become a multi-generational problem where, the mom or dad had like ADHD or a problem with anxiety or some sort of issue where they couldn't be part of church. The challenge is that when kids aren't actively part of church, and I saw a statistic last year that kids who were not, like if you were a teenager and you didn't attend worship on any kind of regular basis, the odds that you would regularly attend church when you were in your mid-20s are 3%. And so part of what we also figured out, having been focused on, being a ministry that help churches work with children, is that this has very much got to be family ministry oriented. And when you're thinking about mental health inclusion, we have to think about how we're going to take care of the adults too. Because, I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a whole lot of 8-year-olds in my practice who will drive themselves to appointments or drive themselves to church. So that if mom or dad has an issue, everybody in the family is likely to have an issue. And as a result, not only do you miss out on the 20% who have a mental health challenge, you miss out on their neurotypical brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, who may not have an issue, but because a family member struggles, that's just not something that they're in the habit of doing together. And so, let me finish up this part before we do the breakouts. And I want you to think about the Phillips family. And, you probably all would recognize these folks. They live down the street from your church. Becky's a single mom. She's raising Josh and Jennifer. So Josh is 9, Jennifer's 7. Josh got invited to Vacation Bible School by one of his friends, had a fabulous time. He wants to come to church every Sunday, and he wants to go to Awana on Wednesday night. So Josh has medicine for ADHD, and he's getting special education services for dyslexia. Jennifer, his sister, has separation anxiety. Becky, the mom, has social anxiety and agoraphobia. What are all the things that could go wrong the first Sunday that they try to come and visit your church? Okay, so let's start with Becky. Okay, so first, Becky has to get comfortable with the notion of coming to church and overcome sort of this hurdle that she's likely to be scrutinized, and the fears that she may go ahead and stand out, or that someone in her family, one of her kids, will do something that will draw attention to them in a negative way. How many people does Becky have to meet the first day she comes to church? Okay, so you probably have greeters at the door, right? There are going to be the folks in children's ministry with whom she needs to register her kids if it's the first time she comes. There is likely to be an usher or some sort of a greeter in your sanctuary or your worship center. There may be people greeting her on the way out. She may be introduced to their child's group leader or Sunday school teacher as a part of this. It's possible that a lot of churches, somebody may be making a follow-up call to make sure that they had a good time the first time that they came to the church. With Jennifer, by the way, what happens with Jennifer when she's clinging to mom and everybody's encouraging her and kind of pushing her to go into the children's ministry area, as opposed to going along with mom? Is it possible that she's going to have a meltdown, sort of in the registration by your children's area? with Josh, what happens when the well-meaning Sunday school teacher encourages all of the kids to take turns reading their Bible out loud when he has dyslexia? So, and again, it's an example of sort of like what would be a typical family that, you would be looking to reach out to in your church, and some of the different struggles that they have. So what we're going to do when we get together at the end of the day is that we're going to talk a little bit about what the solution to some of this might look like, and give you guys some examples of churches that are doing this stuff really well. So with that said, I will turn it back over to Mary, and she will hopefully get you guys to your breakouts.
We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll get Dr. Gersovich up here to talk about the solutions. And then we're also going to, we'll close for only about 5 minutes. We'll have a closing, and then we'll talk about next steps. Because literally, God's been sprinkling seeds in your hearts and in your churches. And now, when we pray, the prayer is for the harvest at the end. Okay, He sprinkled the seeds, going to be on good, fertile ground, and then we'll watch what happens in the end. Dr. Gersovich.
Can you hear? There we go. So I know that, I know that there are many of you who, want to go out and see, Ohio State do the things that bring us happiness and joy every Saturday. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here. If you're interested in sort of seeing our entire model described, and you go to keyministry.org and you click on mental health in the church, we have all kinds of resources there and a whole series of videos that describes how you would work through sort of an entire, mental health inclusion plan. So I want to give you a brief overview of how we approach this with churches, give you a few examples of some places that we've worked with and are aware of around the country that are doing this well, and spend a little bit of time talking about next steps and how my team can kind of help to support your churches and your organizations if you're going to look at going ahead and addressing this. So that one of the things that when we were thinking about this model that I think is really critical is that this can't be a program. Part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a mindset, and we want you to be thinking about, well, what are some of the things that your church does that might be hard for people who struggle with this, so that you can anticipate some of those challenges, and think them through as they happen. And so that we know this can't be a program because, one, folks who struggle with this stuff will not self-identify. As a child psychiatrist, one of the things that I know is that the kids that we see and their parents desperately want to be treated like everybody else. And so they want to do all of the things that everybody else is doing. And anything that calls attention to them being different isn't going to work. So a way of thinking about this is that whatever you do to support folks who struggle with these concerns ought to be stuff that's good for everybody in the church and everybody who might visit the church when you think about applying these principles. The other thing is that this is not something that we can entrust or should be the responsibility of the professional Christians on staff at the church. That if you're going to do this kind of strategy, it's going to work best if the ministry is owned by the people of the church and supported by the clergy. So that, we'll touch on that a little bit. But I don't want you, when you think about this, to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And that while no church is going to be able to do something that's going to fit everybody with every mental health struggle, every single church can do more than what they're doing now to welcome more people than you're welcoming now. And so I will be in the back afterward. We had developed this mental health in the church book that sort of describes the whole thing. I couldn't figure out how to make the credit card thing work on my thing. So if anybody wants one, I'll just go ahead and give a copy to anybody who's going to be interested and read it. But essentially part of what we're doing with this what we did with the book is to get you thinking about are there certain non-essential attributes of some of your ministry environments and activities that make it harder to be part of church. And then thinking about what is it that we can do sort of across the board to help welcome kids and adults into all of the stuff that we do as church that helps people to grow spiritually? So that, what are we doing to help people be part of weekend worship services? How can we help people to have an easier time being a part of a small group, participating in different sorts of service ministries within the church? As we talked about before, thinking this through for children, teens, and adults becomes critical because, folks come to church as a family, and if one member of the family is struggling, it's not going to work. So here's the little acronym that we came up with to remember the 7 inclusion strategies, which is teacher. So the T is developing an inclusion team. E stands for creating welcoming ministry environments or the physical spaces in which ministry takes place. A is to focus on activities that are most critical to spiritual growth. So if in your church people get discipled by being part of a small group, we got to figure out how to train some small group leaders, to be able to help to support these folks when they're getting involved with groups, and figure out a way, figure out a way to get them integrated into the right groups. If that's coming to worship on Sunday and listening to your fabulous preacher teach, we got to figure out a way of being able to get them there. C, and this is probably one of the things I've seen churches do most effectively, and is one of the easier things to do first, is developing a mental health communication strategy. H stands for providing families help with their most heartfelt needs. E is education and support. And then R is giving responsibility for the ministry to the people of your church. And so, again, if you can go through the handout, it'll tell some things about who might be on like your mental health team. But part of what you might want to think about is that in a large church, this would involve having folks who are in charge of sort of each ministry department or area, doing a deep dive and thinking about what this looks like within, say, like children's ministry or student ministry or men's ministry or adult ministry. In a small church, one person's going to be wearing like lots of different hats. So that, the process may not involve necessarily a whole lot of people if you're in a church of 50 or 100. But it should probably involve people who are volunteering or serving in each major area of ministry within the church. If you want to, if you have like a little QR reader on your phone, or if you go to our website, you can download this planning tool. And so basically what it does is it takes the 7 barriers that we had talked about before, it lists the 7 inclusion strategies, and there are like 3 pages of questions that go along with this to think about how each of these would be applied in every different area of ministry, as we were talking about before. Even things like, thinking about, the people who are responsible for like the physical spaces in your church, thinking about your worship team, thinking about sort of like, the senior pastor and the folks who are involved with communication, children's ministry, youth ministry, adult education. Download that, and when you see the questions, I think it'll help you to kind of grasp, how folks apply the model and start thinking through within their specific churches where people are likely to go ahead and get stuck. So some of this stuff, again, for the sake of discussion, you can see in the handout, you can watch videos on our website talking about how folks work through some of these different issues. I do want to take a couple of minutes and talk about the notion of the mental health communication strategy, because some really interesting things that have come out, like research-wise in this area, and I touched during the introductory part this morning about the perceptions that folks have outside the church. During that Lifeway study, when they were surveying several hundred family members of adults with mental illness, the one thing that most people said that they most wanted from their churches were for their pastors to talk about it from the pulpit. So that, if I were thinking about tackling this, or there's a church in our area that we've been working with that's implementing this kind of a strategy. Tomorrow they're doing the second of sort of a 5-part message series on what does Scripture teach about anxiety. would be an example of that. I think I used the example earlier on of the church that we were training where the pastor opened the worship service by offering to pray for people with depression. So the talking about it is huge. There's also, and you can find this in the book and find it in various places on our website, there are things that you not to say that become really important. Like, we don't refer to people as, the manic, or, think about like different derogatory language, that sometimes can be used, because it seems like folks with mental health challenges and Christians are about the only people you can make fun of anymore, sort of in our politically correct society, and not necessarily great to do that with folks with, mental health challenges. One of the things to think about, and this comes in for folks with anxiety, is that the more that they can see of, your church or of a new experience within the church, the easier it's going to be for folks to take part in it. So that, again, that we know that from the research that's out there, a lot of people will watch a church's online services before they go for the first time, for those who, stream it out through Facebook or have it available online. But one of the things that we encourage, like sort of our children's pastors, youth pastors, the one I was talking about before had the retreat in the middle of Lake Erie. If you want kids to go and you want them to be comfortable, take as many pictures as you can the next time you do that and put it up on your website. So things like, if I'm an anxious kid, I'm going to want to know, where am I going to be sleeping? Where am I going to be eating? What am I going to be doing the whole time that I'm there? Because the more that they can see and sort of fill in the places where, their mind is likely to run wild and assume like all kinds of horrible things, the easier it is for folks to be able to, to overcome that sort of anxiety. One of the things that I was talking about with some of the folks, like between the sessions, is that this church that we're working with in Cleveland, if you want to look them up on Facebook, it's Cuyahoga Valley Church. And for Mental Health Awareness Month last month, they had the founding pastor of the church do a 5-minute video that they posted to their Facebook site. And what he said, he started off is, I'm Rick Duncan, I'm the founding pastor of CVC, and I want to let you know that people with mental health challenges are going to be welcomed and embraced at our church. Did a little thing sort of talking about like why this is important to them, a little bit about his own family history. They put it on Facebook, and they bought Facebook advertising so that more of their people would see it. And they put it out there with the intent that folks in the church would share this with other like coworkers, neighbors, families that they were aware of in the community who are struggling and didn't have a church. And using that as a way of being able to extend welcome. So that, like when you think about this, I know that Mary's not on Facebook, but my guess is that most of you are, and most of the people in her church are. And so that one of the ways that you can communicate and sort of change perceptions in the community is to give stuff through social media for your people to share with their friends and neighbors who might be struggling with specific mental health concerns. And so this is the data that I was talking about before, where you take a look at the number of families that want their pastors to talk about this, and the reality is that the vast majority of pastors talk about this either once a year or never, and that's an obvious disconnect and a place where the church can make an immediate impact, because by the pastor standing up and talking about it, you're giving people permission. Some of the things I've seen is, and this was like really powerful. So we were doing a thing last year at a Methodist church in Fredericktown, Ohio. And so I got a chance to go ahead and like teach at the 2 different worship services. But then there was sort of like a congregational sort of meeting in between. And different people in the church, it was facilitated by the pastor, started talking about their family's experience with mental health struggles. And a couple of highly respected folks in the church got up and talked about how this had affected them. Those kinds of conversations, especially with, if a pastor's talking about this, or an elder, or somebody who's been a respected leader, is extraordinarily powerful. Depending upon like the style that your church uses. I've seen other places that have incorporated like an interview with someone, within the church who may have been struggling with this as part of a worship service. I've done a couple of these mental health awareness Sundays, and interestingly enough, I don't know if any of you were there, the first one that we ever did, where I actually spoke and did the teaching during the services, was about 5 or 6 years ago down the street here at the United Methodist Church. So I don't know if any of you happened to come to that, but in the same way that you might have like a Disability Sunday, or tomorrow sort of nationwide is like Orphan Sunday in the United States, sort of highlighting the issues of like adoption and foster care. One of the ways, if you were thinking about doing some sort of an event, is to have a specific mental health related Sunday. And I know that Mary offered to go ahead and talk at a couple of those, and she'd be like a wonderful resource, for folks in this neck of the woods, or other people in this room might be a great resource if you're looking to go ahead and do this. Crossroads in Mansfield, if you wanted to take a look at a church within driving distance of here that is doing a phenomenal job of addressing this, has an entire mental health kiosk near the entry of their church, and they had developed some different awareness cards that they are willing to share with other churches. If you take a look, there's a guy there, Jeremy Smith, who does this church and mental health blog. If you Google that and look it up, they have an order form for churches to be able to access, some of those kinds of materials to share with other things that your church may be sharing. One of the things that is really critical, and part of how we show the love of Christ to folks, is by the church doing tangible things to meet heartfelt needs. And I was talking to some folks between the presentations that 3 years ago, our most popular blog post was entitled, "We Had No Casseroles." And where this came from was that there was a 60-minute segment where they were interviewing parents of teens and young adults in Virginia who were having a hard time accessing services. And one of the moms had commented during this interview with the guy from 60 Minutes that when their 13-year-old daughter broke her leg on a ski trip and ended up in the hospital for a week for surgery, they had meals from their church every single night. 6 months later, when she overdosed and ended up in a psychiatric hospital for a week, there were no casseroles. And so, you think about the things that we do for folks when they have a physical health problem. Like those kinds of supports are really critical when a family is going through a struggle around a mental health issue. And we need to make sure that folks know that it's okay to ask for those services, or that the people responsible for them identify folks in the community who may not be part of the church and offer that to them as a gift. One of the things that, when we're talking about that survey of what families most wanted, where there was the biggest disconnect between what churches thought they were doing well and what families needed, had to do with having current referral lists to mental health professionals in the community. So that, in the Lifeway survey, 68% of pastors believed that they had an up-to-date and current list. 28% of families found that to be the case. So that we know that the church is the initial point of contact for a great many people struggling with this. And you think about like Mary's model that she used at the beginning of the morning. One of the things would be to become familiar with the mental health resources in the community where you're at, and to develop relationships with folks to make sure that folks serving on staff at the church, when people come looking for counseling or come in crisis, are able to find the kinds of services that they need in the community. One of the things that we have seen that's been very powerful, at our own church where we had 80 kids who were hosted last night, is respite care. In that, again, families that are struggling with this can't find childcare. And so that one of the ways of providing a tangible benefit that brings outside people into the church, or by offering respite events. The other way that this is done for churches that are small, that don't have the resources to do this, is relational respite. So that, it's asking people who are part of a small group to identify one family in their neighborhood or their community who may be struggling. And different couples or adults, in that small group may take turns providing respite or doing other tangible kinds of services to be able to support the family. I was telling you about Crossroads in Mansfield. This is their next steps area. And so that they specifically have people there who are trained to staff this at each of their worship services for folks who may have mental health concerns, that they will help people get into groups, and they actually have set up a satellite office of their local community mental health center within the church so that people at the church can get directly connected during worship services and during the week to services without having to go ahead and leave the building. One of the things that they've also done that's really helpful and that they have available on Jeremy's blog is that they've developed a mental health crisis response plan that other churches can freely borrow if someone comes to the church, and acutely is talking about like having a plan to kill themselves, having a plan to hurt somebody else. They have a specific protocol that they're willing to share with other places that are looking to have something like that in place. Now, there are a couple of places, and I don't know what happened to the picture with this, but we see different churches that are actually developing counseling centers and other kinds of resources to meet the need. So there's in our part of the state, there's something called Fieldstone Counseling that was started by Parkside Church, where they now have several different satellite offices, and they're working in partnership with different churches throughout the greater Cleveland area, to be able to make this sort of counseling available to folks. A really cool model is called KESED, K-H-E-S-E-D, and this was actually started by Chuck Swindoll's granddaughter out in Colorado. And what they do is that they work with churches, particularly in urban or lower income areas that may be smaller and have available office space. And they have a network of counselors where the counselors agree to provide reduced fee care in exchange for free office space in the churches. Another interesting way of meeting needs in the community. There are lots of different resources available for like mental health education and support. Mental health first aid is something that we're seeing a lot of churches go through, as well as places that are getting specific training in trauma-informed care. I want to talk to you about a couple of organizations that are doing phenomenal work where they have national networks now of Christian-based mental health support groups. And so that the two primary ones would be the Grace Alliance and Fresh Hope. The Grace Alliance was actually started by Matthew Stanford together with a pastor from Baylor. And that was the guy with the Grace for the Afflicted book that Mary talked to you about beforehand. They have time-limited groups that tend to be 10 to 15 weeks in length for individuals and families who have struggled with mental illness. They have a specific group with a trauma-focused, and they have a 10-week model that they use for college students. The Grace Alliance was started by a guy named Brad Hafes, or not the Grace Alliance, Fresh Hope was started by a guy named Brad Hafes, who was the pastor of the largest Missouri Synod Lutheran church in America. When 25 years ago he had a manic episode, was found exposing himself in public by a police officer, got fired from the church, and a group of members of the church got together and they planted a new church and they hired him as pastor. And they've developed, again, a more open-ended model so that like the grace groups are time limited, Fresh Hope groups go on indefinitely. Their groups involve individuals and families for part of the group, and then they go ahead and separate them out. They also have a model that is used in prison ministry as well as a model that's used with teens. So a couple of other ideas that I've seen folks use is, Stevens ministers are a neat way that some churches are using, to have extra people to come alongside folks who may be struggling. The notion of a mental health liaison, or identifying one point of contact for people who may be struggling with an issue in the church or exploring coming to a church. Someone who's anxious, may be overwhelmed by the prospect of meeting lots of different folks, but if they could email one person with the ability to serve as a liaison with different staff members or volunteer leaders in the church, that's oftentimes something that folks find helpful when there's a specific challenge that they're struggling with and not able to meet. Now, overall, I told some folks between the different talks that If I got to rewrite the book, the 8th inclusion strategy would be this, that the best way of doing this ministry is probably by having an individual Christian who is aware of friends or family or neighbors who are struggling, to invite that person to church and to come alongside them in the early stages when they're going. And someone who can anticipate some of the things that might be hard from a social standpoint, that might be hard from a sensory standpoint, and help them then to be able to navigate some of those obstacles without necessarily drawing a lot of attention to themselves. So, when we were thinking about what are some of the things that we would look for if we were to develop sort of a nationwide network of mental health literate churches, here would be sort of the 5 things that, and this is sort of like the ideal. So if you were one of these task-oriented people where, you want to do everything that you need to do, even though this is not a program, this is a process, would be to have, be able to demonstrate that your church went through some sort of an intentional planning process, had some sort of education around mental health related issues for your staff and for your key volunteers, that there would be evidence of a mental health communication strategy that we had talked about, preaching it from the pulpit, communicating things out, again, to the larger community to change some of the perceptions that exist about stigma, that you would be offering some sort of tangible, practical help to people in the community, inside and outside the church, who are wrestling with this, and that you would be offering some sort of mental health-based education or support group. So, if you're thinking, what does this look like at the end? This is what it probably looks like at the end. So if you're a senior pastor here today, I'd encourage you to pray for discernment and to go to some of your other staff or key volunteers and get them to buy in. If you're on staff but you're not the lead pastor at your church, pray about it, and then I would approach your senior leadership looking for guidance and support. If you are here and if you are a counselor or if you are an amateur Christian and not like getting a paycheck from a particular church, one of the things I tell folks is that it's not that like your church leaders are the embodiment of Satan if they don't want to go into this like whole hog after you come and approach us. Because having sat on 2 church elder boards, I know that there are way more cool ministry opportunities than there are like money or resources to be able to undertake everything. So that, if it's not something that your church is up to right now, you can think about how you can make this a personal area of ministry, with, people who God has put in your life who may be having some of these struggles. So one of the things that we would be honored to do, as a ministry team, is to come alongside you guys and support you with whatever you do with some of the things that you started to work on today. And so we offer lots of, as much as possible, free training, consultation, resources, support, to churches that are looking at doing mental health ministry as well as other kinds of disability ministry. So that I'd encourage you guys, the conference that Mary talked about, Inclusion Fusion Live, is going to be the last weekend in April. It is the largest disability ministry conference in the United States. So we're going to have, we had 40 speakers last year and folks from 25 states who came to this. We will have significant areas of the program that are focused on mental health. We have an entire video training series that you will be able to find on our website, and a Vimeo page where we have an entire library of video resources going back several years now that people can feel free to use in their churches. We do a monthly roundtable, and that every 3 months, the inclusion roundtable that we do on the 3rd Wednesday of each month is mental health focused. We would love you to be part of that. We provide consultation to teams at churches that are working on these kinds of issues. We have a mental health inclusion ministry leaders group on Facebook, which is similar to the disability ministry leaders group that we have that has 1,600 members in it. We have like 100 now in the mental health group, but we're trying to get people networked together to support one another. And we also have other kinds like social media resources. We can get you connected up with other people who are doing cool work in this field to be able to support you as you go forward with this. And so that lovely person up there is Catherine Boyle. She is our Director of Mental Health Ministry. If you are interested in any support from us, you can email her. It's catherine@keyministry.org. If you'd like to email me, it's steve@keyministry.org. I will be around for a while afterwards, and again, if any of you want a book and need a book, we're happy to go ahead and give that to you if you're gonna, take it and look through it and think about how this might be applicable to the church. But when I was talking to Mary, this is phenomenal, the turnout today, and I don't want it to end here. I want this to be the first step. And so if you get connected up with us, we'll figure out how to connect you up with other people. And we'd be honored to come alongside you as you look at implementing some of the things that we talked about today. So thank you for that. Be happy to talk to some of you guys later. And I will let Mary or someone else take it from here.
Thank you. Wasn't he fantastic? As you can tell, we did not design this event to help you to know how to deal with age-appropriate behavior for the 10-year-olds. We designed this event to help you with the kids who don't usually display age-appropriate behavior. Their behavior is a little outside of that, or the adults who are displaying behavior that is a little bit different than what everybody else is doing. And we hope that you gained a few tools for how to do that. We want to thank all of you for coming. We want to thank our partners at Blanchard Valley Foundation who helped us with this event and will help us with some future events. We hope to drive down the cost for future events a great deal, thanks to their generous ongoing partnership and the partnership of other people and other grants. This is the first of events like this. We hope to do many in the future. We hope planning next year to do a couple of events that will be here, a couple in local churches. Those are already on our planning board. We hope to do that with denominational partners. We're in conversation with several of those to be able to help equip pastors. We hope to partner with community organizations, and we have something that we're working on there as well. We hope that this is the beginning in Northwest Ohio of conversation between a dialogue between churches and mental wellness professionals for how we can better serve people in congregations. In order to help us with those future events, we're going to send out a link that will have an evaluation form. It'll be just a couple of questions. It'll come to you through email. We ask that you would take just a moment to help us with that. If you think that Doctors Mary and Kelly Jo and Karen were brilliant, tell us that. If you think that the room was a little too cool, and the rooms out there were a little too warm, tell us that. We didn't really have a lot of control over it, but we'll go back to facilities and say, hey, we need to work on this a little bit. So we look forward to hearing you in those kinds of things, and we are going to establish a special web page for this event and for future events like it, so that the resources that were made available today, any that the presenters wish to share, we will make available there. If you saw something great on a PowerPoint but didn't quite get it, we hope that you'll be able to get that from that website. Let's pray, shall we? Father, thank you so much for the day that we've had today. We have been so greatly blessed by our keynote speaker, by our workshops, by our wonderful students who did a workshop. Lord, we have been blessed to be with each other and to talk about how we can better serve those who we have contact with every week. We thank you for your presence that's been here and will go with us as we leave this place. We thank you for it all in Jesus' name. Amen.